At my 65th birthday, my son called me a useless old man and boasted of how he was taking over everything from me. I smiled and didn't react immediately. 3 days later, the bank called him. What happened next shocked everyone. I will tell you everything. Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories like this, I'd appreciate it if you'd click like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And if you don't mind, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's take a step back to where it all began. My son tapped his glass with a spoon before I'd even finished sitting down. The sharp clink cut through the room, and just like that, everyone turned to him. Forks paused midair. Conversation stopped. All eyes on him. I was still adjusting my jacket sleeve, still taking in the bright lights and the heavy smell of truffle oil, when he smiled and said, "All right, everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment." Nobody looked at me. That should have told me something right then, but I let it slide, like I've let a lot of things slide over the years. He'd booked one of those trendy private rooms, the kind of place he loves. Concrete walls, abstract art that doesn't make sense, and a menu that sounds more like a poem than a dinner list. He even called it overpriced fusion, like that was a selling point. My name had been on the reservation. The hostess confirmed that, twice. But the second we walked in, it became his show. He greeted the guests before I could, took compliments that weren't meant for him, sat himself at the head of the table without asking. I ended up 2 seats down, off to the side, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to feel like a guest at my own birthday. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't even want a party, that this was just his way of showing love, loud, flashy, a little self-centered. I watched him hold court, watched how people leaned in when he spoke. And I tried not to notice how easily he slipped into the role of host. Every few minutes someone would glance my way with a polite smile. Then their eyes would drift back to him. Another story, another joke, expansion plans, market trends, business, business, business. I sat there, nodding when it felt right, hands folded in my lap, telling myself that silence was dignity. I didn't realize then just how costly that silence would become. Across the table, my granddaughter was swinging her legs. She had already lost interest in the small gift I brought, something simple but meaningful. She opened it carefully, smiled politely, and set it aside. Then my son pulled out a brand new iPad, still in the box. Her face lit up like a switch. She crawled into his lap without hesitation, her attention shifting completely. Not out of rudeness, just gravity. And right there, I felt a little pinch in my chest. Not jealousy, just the quiet reminder that sometimes presence gets outshined by spectacle. My wife noticed. She always does. She reached under the table and brushed my knee, a silent check-in we've perfected over the years. Her smile stayed put, but her eyes said enough. She wasn't comfortable either. And then he started talking about the family businesses. Loud, confident, like he was pitching to investors. He talked about growth, about how modern things had become since he took over. I heard phrases like outdated systems and old-school thinking. Not quite insults, but they stung all the same. Still, I stayed quiet. What got to me most wasn't the bragging. It was how natural it seemed. Like this had always been the story, his story. As if I'd just been along for the ride. Some people at the table looked impressed. Others looked unsure. And I wondered, how many of them actually believed him? And how many were just too polite to question it? That's when I realized, you don't need to be right when you're the loudest voice in the room. Dinner came out in fancy little courses, each one introduced like a Broadway act. I barely tasted a bite. The noise in the room rose and fell, full of laughter that felt just a little too rehearsed. Every so often, he'd flash me a grin, the kind that says, "See, you're included too." And I'd smile back, because that's what I do. I remember thinking, aging doesn't make you invisible. It just makes people more comfortable ignoring you. But I knew better. This wasn't just about age. This was about choices. And choices, once made, always come back around. The toast came near the end. He stood again, glass in hand. Big performance. I won't share the words just yet. I'll get to them. But I remember the feeling. How the air in the room got tight. A few people laughed, then stopped, waiting to see how I'd react. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a bad joke. It was a statement. A line being drawn. I smiled, nodded, lifted my glass, just water these days, and said, "You've certainly taken over." Everyone exhaled. Nervous laughter returned. The moment was dismissed as harmless. But something inside me shifted. I didn't make a scene. I never do. But I also knew I wasn't going to let this stand forever. By the time the check came, something he insisted on handling, I wasn't even there anymore, mentally. My mind had already gone to places I hadn't visited in years. The old files, the structures, the backup plans. I didn't act on anything that night. I hugged my granddaughter, kissed my wife, thanked everyone for coming, let him have his spotlight. But as we stepped into the cool night air, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just a birthday. It was the beginning of something bigger. And when the consequences came, they wouldn't be loud at all. The silence after my son's toast hung in the air longer than it should have. You could feel it, a weird, uncomfortable pause where everyone waited for someone else to break it. Finally, someone laughed, just a little too late, like they were trying to catch a cue that never really came. I watched the faces around the table. Some looked confused. A few seemed amused. One or two were clearly embarrassed. And right then, I knew, whatever my son had meant as a joke didn't land the way he thought it would. My wife tightened her grip on her napkin. A cousin cleared his throat. Someone across the table said my name quietly, like they were checking if I was still okay. I smiled again, because that's what I do. Smile. Keep things light. But inside, I felt the first crack. That toast didn't come from nowhere. It was rehearsed, practiced. That wasn't a spur-of-the-moment jab. It was something he'd been holding onto for a while. We ended the night the way people usually do after something awkward happens, by pretending it didn't. The plates were cleared. Coats went on. People gave me polite hugs and said vague things like, "He didn't mean it," or, "You know how he is." I just nodded, letting their discomfort confirm what I already felt. I wasn't imagining it. On the drive home, my wife stared out the window, silent. Streetlights flicked across her face like little flashes of thought. Then, softly, she asked, "Are you okay?" I told her I was fine. It was easier to say than to explain what was actually running through my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there replaying his words. Not just what he said, but how he said it. No nerves. No hesitation. He stood there and spoke like someone making a statement, not testing a joke. And that's what bothered me the most. That wasn't a mistake. That was a mindset. At some point, my son had stopped seeing me as essential. Not just old, not just past my prime, but replaced. And the hardest part? I couldn't pinpoint when it started. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It came in bits and pieces. Small memories clicking into place. The meetings he'd stopped inviting me to. The decisions he told me about after they were already made. The way he'd call my advice old school, even after it saved him from trouble. Back then, I told myself it was just a generational gap. Just a strong-willed son wanting to prove himself. But lying there in the dark, I saw it for what it really was. It wasn't independence. It was a quiet push toward the door. 2 days later, something small happened. Something I might have brushed off before. A vendor I'd worked with for over 20 years called me, just to thank me for being flexible about a recent deal. I was confused. I hadn't spoken to him in months. He explained that my son had said I was fine with the changes. Casual. No big deal. But it was a big deal. He was still using my name, still leaning on my credibility, while telling others that I wasn't really involved anymore. That's when I realized this wasn't just arrogance. It was calculated. So I started paying closer attention. Emails sent to me for final approval on decisions that had already been made. Jokes tossed out like, "Dad's mostly retired anyway," said with a laugh that waited for agreement. Even my wife started noticing it. How often he spoke about the future like I wasn't going to be a part of it. None of it, on its own, was outrageous. But together, it painted a very clear picture. He wasn't just stepping into the spotlight. He was quietly pushing me off the stage, still using the business I built, the name I gave him, the network I handed over, but rewriting the story to put himself at the center. And I'll be honest, at first, I wondered if I'd let this happen. Maybe I'd stepped back too far. Maybe by trying to avoid conflict, I gave him the space to take more than he should have. It stung to admit it. Still does. But I needed to face that truth before I could do anything about it. I thought that by trusting him, I was helping him grow into a leader. That by stepping aside a little, I was making room for him to shine. But now, it was clear he couldn't see the line between support and surrender. And that toast, wrapped in charm and delivered like a joke, wasn't just some offhand comment. It was a message. To the room, I'm in charge now. To me, you're done. And to himself, you don't need to pretend anymore. Oddly enough, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was alert. Like I'd finally woken up and realized what was actually happening. I didn't call him out. Not then. I answered his texts. Chatted like nothing had changed. Let him believe I'd moved on. But I was watching now. Not out of bitterness. Out of clarity. Because once I acted, once I spoke up, there wouldn't be any turning back. He thought the toast was the final chapter. A closing note. But I knew better. It was just the opening line. 2 days after the party, I opened the old leather binder that had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk for years. The one with the cracked spine and that familiar smell of paper and time. I hadn't planned on opening it. I'd reached for a pen, and somehow, my hand landed on the edge of the drawer instead, like my body knew where I needed to go before my mind caught up. When I placed the binder on the desk, I felt its weight. Not just the physical kind, but the emotional kind. Inside was the foundation of everything my son thought he built on his own. And for the first time in a long while, I had to admit that to myself. I sat there for a while, flipping through documents I could recite in my sleep. Trust agreements, ownership breakdowns, carefully worded clauses I'd written with the kind of caution that only comes from losing something once and never wanting to feel that way again. I'd put all this in place years ago, before retirement was even on the horizon. Back when my son still asked questions instead of giving answers. At the time, it felt like the responsible thing to do. Now, it felt like a blueprint he never knew existed. He thought he was flying. He didn't realize there was a net under him the entire time. That afternoon, I got an email from him. Just forwarded a document. No message. He wanted my sign-off on a financing move tied to one of his newer ventures, the ones he loves to talk about like they're Silicon Valley startups. The tone was casual, like my approval was just a box to check. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I traced the document backwards, followed the ownership trail through the trust. Back to me. I'd done this so many times before, quietly making adjustments behind the scenes to keep things stable, to keep him looking like he had it all under control. He thought he was steering the ship. He didn't know I was the one keeping it from crashing. And once I opened that door, the memories came flooding in. The loan I gave him when he lost that big client, but didn't want anyone to know. The tax issue I cleaned up after he missed a deadline. Told him it was a systems error, just to protect his pride. The vendor I called personally to keep things from getting legal. Each time, I told myself I was helping him grow. Each time, I let him take the credit. I believed that confidence needed space. But I didn't realize I was giving it too much room, starving it of something even more important, humility. And then, just for a moment, I let myself feel it, the guilt. The truth hit hard. My generosity had become a disguise. I was shielding him from consequences, and in doing that, I gave him the illusion that he'd done it all on his own. I'd helped create this version of him, the one who could stand up at my birthday dinner and dismiss me like I didn't matter. And that hurt more than anything he said that night, because it meant I wasn't just the target. I was also part of the problem. Later that evening, the phone rang. Different number. It was an old business partner, someone I trusted, semi-retired now. He wanted to confirm something. Did you approve that restructuring your son mentioned? He said you were fully on board. I told him I was reviewing it. But after the call, I sat there in silence. The pattern was too obvious to ignore now. My son wasn't just stepping into leadership. He was borrowing mine, leaning on my name, my legacy, using it when it helped him, while also making sure I looked like I'd already stepped aside. That takes a special kind of confidence, and a special kind of fear. By the weekend, I stopped pretending this was temporary or innocent. I started keeping records, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Dates, emails, deals made without consulting me. Times he dropped my name like a shield while quietly cutting me out. It felt strange, like I was doing an audit of my own son. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about stewardship. I built all of this to last. not to be gutted by someone who confused volume for leadership. If I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just be stepping aside. I'd be failing everything I'd worked for. One night, late Sunday, I almost called him. Almost laid it all out, the truth behind the curtain. I pictured him as a teenager, sitting right here at this desk, asking questions with wide eyes, wanting to understand, wanting to grow. But I didn't call. He wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. If I tried to explain now, it would just confirm what he already believed, that I was trying to control him. What he needs is absence. The kind that teaches. The kind that makes you realize just how much someone was doing once they stop. By Monday morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Clarity. Not sadness. Not anger. Just a firm, steady understanding of what had to happen next. And I knew, when I started making changes, people might think I was being harsh. That I was overreacting. Let them. I didn't build all of this by worrying what people thought. I built it by planning for storms. And this one, I saw it coming. As I closed the binder and slid it back into the drawer, one thought settled in. Real power doesn't need applause. It doesn't shout. It doesn't flex. It waits. And when it moves with precision. He thought I stepped aside because I was done. He never noticed the training wheels holding him up. But he's about to find out what it means to ride without them. 3 days after the party, I found myself sitting across from the trust officer, in a room that felt more like a vault than an office. Quiet, neutral, designed to keep emotion out. She paused the video mid-sentence, my son's frozen smile still on the screen between us, and asked, "Is this behavior new?" Her voice wasn't accusing. It wasn't even sympathetic. Just careful. And somehow, that question hit harder than anything my son said at dinner. Because it framed the situation for what it really was. Not just a moment, but a pattern. I told her no. It had been building. And the moment I said it out loud, I realized this meeting wasn't about considering action. It was the action. The trust office sat on its own floor, glass walls, quiet halls, everything designed to feel steady and controlled. I'd been there years ago, when we first set everything up. Back when my son was still too young to see the word beneficiary as anything but a future gift. This time was different. I wasn't planning for what might happen. I was responding to what already had. I explained everything clearly, without bitterness. I talked about stewardship, about decision-making, about the risk to everything we'd built. I didn't start with the toast. I let the paper trail speak first. Emails, approvals taken for granted, authority assumed. Only then did I slide the tablet across the table and let her hear what he said that night. I'd already prepared a letter. Printed. Signed. Straightforward. A request to place a temporary freeze on all accounts and disbursements tied to my son's authority. Not punitive. Just procedural. Just responsible. As I handed it over, I felt a strange kind of weight lift off me. Not victory. Not relief exactly. Just the feeling of finally putting something down I'd been carrying too long. I knew how this would look to him. I knew he'd see it as betrayal. But I also knew that if I didn't act now, what came next would be worse. For him, for the business, for everyone. By that afternoon, the wheels were already turning. Institutions move fast when the instructions are clear. No drama. No headlines. Just process. I walked out of the building, got in my car, and sat there for a moment. Hands on the wheel. Not thinking. Just steady. Somewhere across town, my son was going about his day like nothing had changed. That wouldn't last long. Consequences don't send warnings. They just arrive. Usually in the form of a phone call that doesn't go the way you expect. That call came to him first. I wasn't there to hear it, but I didn't need to be. I could picture it clearly. A calm voice saying, "We're contacting you regarding a temporary suspension of access to all business and personal accounts linked to the family trust." No drama. No details. Just policy. That night, his company card was declined at a restaurant, not unlike the one he'd chosen for my birthday. Ironic, sure, but I didn't feel smug when I heard about it later. What I felt was tension, pressure, reality. This wasn't theory anymore. The next morning, I got a notification confirming the freeze had gone through. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my wife. "What did you do?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know her the truth, but because I needed to be careful with it. This wasn't just about my son. It was about everything we'd built, including our marriage. Eventually, I wrote back. I took steps to protect the trust. We'd talk that evening. And we did. That night, we sat at the kitchen table. The same one where we used to help him with school projects. The same one where we made big decisions, celebrated small wins, and held each other through losses. I told her everything. Not defensively, not with excuses, just the truth. She listened, quietly, eyes steady, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. He went too far, she said. It wasn't permission. It was understanding, and it meant more than I expected. By the end of the week, I started hearing things. His CFO resigned. Quietly. No statements. No fuss. Just done. Uncertainty at the top. That was the phrase someone used. And that phrase stuck with me, because it was honest. Authority without grounding creates anxiety. Confidence built on performance doesn't last when the spotlight goes out. I wondered if my son was starting to see that the ground he stood on wasn't as solid as he thought. That maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been his footing keeping things steady after all. My phone filled up with missed calls. 10 by the end of the day. No voicemails. Just silence followed by another ring. Each one felt like a knock on a door I wasn't ready to open. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because the space mattered. He needed to feel the stillness. To sit in it long enough to realize this wasn't about control. It was about consequence. That evening, my wife and I didn't talk much. We didn't have to. The shift had already happened. And by the end of that week, the ripple effects had started to show. Mutual friends asked questions. One even asked if I planned to smooth things over. I just said, a review is underway. That was enough. No yelling. No declarations. My son had built his presence on performance. I was dismantling it with process. That difference? That's what would make all the difference. I didn't know yet how he'd react when we finally spoke. Anger? Shame? Denial? Maybe all of it. But I knew one thing for sure. The illusion was gone. The accounts had gone quiet. The net had been pulled back, just enough for him to feel the drop. And even though it was hard to sit in the silence, I reminded myself, this wasn't the ending. This was the middle, the messy part, the necessary part, the part where the truth finally has space to settle in. The voicemail came late on a Sunday night. Not like the others. He didn't hang up after 2 rings. He didn't send another half-angry text. This time he waited. When the message started, I could hear him breathing, uneven, like he'd been pacing. Like he didn't know what to say, but couldn't carry the silence any longer. Dad, he said, and then he paused. That pause told me more than any apology would have. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. No sharp edges. No confidence to hide behind. I don't understand what's happening. Everything's locked. People are leaving. I need to talk to you. No apology, but no posturing either. And that, in its own way, was a beginning. I listened to the message twice. Then I set the phone down, face first. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. Not physically tired. The kind of tired that sits in your chest after you've watched someone you love mistake noise for strength and motion for direction. That's when I realized what I'd really been waiting for wasn't an apology. It was recognition. For him to see that this wasn't about control or money. It was about respect. The kind that should have been there without needing to be earned back. And until he understood that, anything he said would be just that, noise. And noise fades fast. But real understanding? That takes time. Over the next few days, I stayed quiet. Deliberately. I kept my routine. Morning walks. Coffee at the same table. Paperwork in the afternoon. The world kept moving, even if his head tilted. And honestly, that felt important. People reached out. Not directly, of course, but through questions. Through updates disguised as concern. Is the freeze permanent? Will leadership change? Should we be worried? I didn't answer any of it. Not because I was hiding, but because for once, I was letting the silence speak for itself. I'd spent decades being reachable, making things easier, soothing egos. This time, I chose distance. Not to punish, but to give the truth some room. And in that space, I started thinking about legacy. Not the kind you print in annual reports. Not about plaques or titles, or who gets the last word. Real legacy. To me, that's about building something strong enough to outlast you. and then knowing when to protect it from being hollowed out by someone who thinks the spotlight is the structure. I tried to teach him that once, back when he listened, but applause has a way of drowning out wisdom. And I wondered, maybe silence is the only thing loud enough to cut through it now. Midweek, an old friend stopped by. Someone I'd built this with back in the early days, when success was earned lunch by lunch, not declared over dinner. We sat on the porch as the sun stretched shadows across the wood. I told him the truth, not the dramatic version, just the facts. When I finished, he didn't rush in with advice. He just nodded. You gave him room, he said. Maybe too much. But you didn't give him permission to forget who built the floor he's standing on. That mattered, not because I needed a pat on the back, but because it reminded me, restraint isn't weakness. That night, I found myself thinking about my son when he was little, sitting cross-legged on the office floor, sorting papers just to feel involved. He used to ask, why do we do it this way? Not to challenge me, but because he wanted to understand. I missed that version of him, not because he was easy, but because he was curious. Somewhere between then and now, curiosity turned into certainty, and certainty hardened into arrogance. And I honestly didn't know if the man he'd become could find his way back. But I knew this. If I kept shielding him from consequences, he'd never even try. 2 days later, he called again. This time, I answered. Let it ring once. Then picked up. No small talk. He jumped straight into frustration, into explanations, defenses, blame. I let him talk. Didn't interrupt. And when he finally stopped, waiting for me to argue or justify, I said one thing. You thought I was gone. I wasn't. He went quiet, longer than I expected, and in that silence, I could feel it. Something shifting. Not fully, but enough. I didn't explain everything, not yet. Didn't walk him through the binder or the backup plans. I told him what the freeze was. A review, a pause, a mirror, a chance to see what he'd built and what he hadn't. He tried to push back, tried to negotiate. I let him speak. Then I told him, when you're ready to listen, really listen, we'll talk. In person. The call ended without resolution, but it didn't end in anger. That felt significant, fragile, but real. Afterward, I sat alone, just breathing. I admitted something to myself, once and only once. I missed my son, not the CEO version, not the man trying to prove something to a room, the one who used to ask questions, the one who thought learning mattered more than winning. And that hurt, because it meant there was a real chance he might never come back. But it also clarified something for me. I can't compromise the line I finally drew. Love without limits brought us here. Love with boundaries might be the only way forward. A reckoning was coming, not the kind that explodes, the kind that lands quietly, like truth usually does. I didn't know yet if it would rebuild us or break us for good, but I did know this. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't need the spotlight. It doesn't demand attention at parties. It waits. It watches. And when it's tested, it shows who was paying attention all along. He showed up 10 minutes early. That told me more than anything he'd said in the past few weeks. I watched from the window as he sat in his car, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead, like someone rehearsing lines he no longer believed in. When he finally came inside, he didn't scan the house like he used to, didn't comment on the furniture or the paint. He walked straight to the table, sat down across from me, shoulders tight, jaw set, eyes alert, but unsure. I slid a folder toward the center of the table. Thick, but neat. I didn't say anything right away. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, intentional, until he finally asked, "What is this?" That question, small and quiet, told me everything I needed to know. This conversation was going to end differently than all the others. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list his mistakes. I just told him, clearly, calmly, what the folder represented. The trust, the ownership structure, the safety nets he never noticed because he never had to. I walked him through how control worked, where authority came from, why the freeze had been put in place, not to punish, but to draw a line. And as I spoke, I watched something shift in him. Not anger this time, not defensiveness, something closer to shock. He started to interrupt once, but stopped himself. That mattered. He was actually listening. Just once, I let myself get personal. I told him what it felt like to sit at my own birthday dinner and hear myself described like a relic. I didn't make it dramatic. I didn't attack him. I just said it for what it was, a moment I won't forget. Then I told him something I wish he'd understood sooner. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned by recognizing the shoulders you stand on. And I could see it settle in. This wasn't about money. It was about trust. Trust he treated like a given, not a gift. Then, I laid out the boundary. Clear. Firm. Final. The trust would stay in place, but his access would change. From now on, oversight would be reinstated. Major decisions would require review. No more mixing personal expenses into business accounts. If he wanted independence, he'd have to build it outside of what I created. But he couldn't keep using my foundation while pretending it wasn't there. No more quiet favors. No more invisible saves. I wasn't stepping back anymore, and I wasn't stepping in to rescue him either. The net would stay where it belonged. Whether or not he learned to walk without it, that was up to him. He didn't fight me. Not really. He asked questions, practical ones. How long would the review last? What would it take to rebuild trust? I answered them, honestly, clearly. I told him this wasn't a performance he could win with urgency or charm. This would take time. It would take humility. And when he nodded, I knew it wasn't agreement. It was acceptance. And for now, that was enough. After he left, the house felt different. Still, but not heavy. I sat there, alone at the table, hands resting on that folder, my folder, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ownership. Not over the business. Not over assets. But over my own voice. Setting boundaries this late in life doesn't undo all the years you went without them. But it does change what comes next. I hadn't lost my son. I hadn't won him back either. But I had done something just as important. I'd taken back the right to not disappear quietly. And I wasn't giving that up again. In the weeks that followed, the changes became visible. Decisions slowed down. Conversations got more careful. Some people backed away, uncomfortable with a system that demanded accountability. Others stayed, grateful for something solid beneath their feet again. My son never said thank you. Never apologized, not directly. But he stopped talking over me. He started asking questions again. Not many. Not yet. But enough to show me something had shifted from collapse to construction. And I stayed quiet. Not distant. Just intentional. Because guidance isn't about control. It's about knowing when to speak and when silence teaches more. I thought back often to that birthday night. How close I came to letting that one moment become the story's end. But here's the truth I know now. Aging doesn't make you weak. It just shows you where you've been too generous with your silence. I'd spent years confusing patience with surrender, support with invisibility. Taking back control wasn't about reclaiming power. It was about restoring balance. I don't need a title to matter. I don't need applause to be relevant. What I needed, and what I finally claimed, was the right to be seen as the foundation, not the afterthought. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this, boundaries don't break families. Avoiding them does. I didn't cut him off. I didn't walk away. I stood still and made it clear where I end and where he begins. Whatever we build from here, it'll be based on truth, not illusion, not entitlement. And if any of this feels familiar to you, if you've ever shrunk to keep the peace, if you've let someone rewrite your role, thinking love required it, let me leave you with this. It's never too late to stand up. And sometimes, standing still is enough. If this story resonated with you, take a moment. Like the video. Share it with someone who's still shrinking. Subscribe if you want more stories about family, legacy, and the quiet strength it takes to say, enough. See you soon in the next story.